Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Eric Fields, the psychologist turned weight loss coach. Today, I'm discussing being human and accepting that we have a vulnerability, and we will have this vulnerability to some degree, most if not all of our lives. And that is not tragic because if you make the progress that you need to make and you address the problem, then everything is good. In psychology, we measure progress with three dimensions of behavior. And the three dimensions of behavior that we look at are the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of that behavior. And when it comes to addiction or any kind of psychological dependency to something, if you don't like that word, we also use FIDS, it stands for frequency, intensity, and duration, to measure urges. Now, the more progress you make breaking free of an addiction, the more that the urges to do that thing decrease and reduce in intensity and don't last as long. So we also use FIDS to measure urges as well. So I've told you all that I am just like you, and I had a pretty significant food addiction problem. And do I still have a food addiction problem? Well, no, because to constitute a problem, it has to have an adverse impact on your life. And it should have a significant adverse impact on your life, or it should be impacting your life to a large degree or often, right? And that doesn't happen to me. However, with that being said, I am not perfect and I am still vulnerable to this food addiction problem or this, I should say, food addiction vulnerability. And so there are times that I do give in once in a while. And I'm totally okay with that. And you should be too. A lot of times my patients or clients will ask me, will I ever get to a place where this is never an issue? You won't probably ever get to a place where it's never an issue in the sense that it doesn't ever happen. But you will definitely and can definitely get to a place where it hardly ever happens because the frequency will be very reduced. And if it does happen, it won't happen to the magnitude that it's happened before because the intensity will be reduced. And it won't lead to a case of the efforts where we just say, to hell with this and go totally off track for days, weeks, or even months. And so the duration especially will be very reduced. And we as human beings, since we are by nature flawed people, right? It's pretty much a definition of the word. We need to accept that we have certain flaws and weaknesses and that that's fine, especially if we're doing something about it and we're addressing them. And especially if we can look back and see all the progress that we've made and, kind of look at that in comparison and say, hey, compared to where I was a month ago, a year ago, several years ago, wow, I'm doing great. So you will always have this vulnerability, but this vulnerability won't always have you. In other words, you will be in control, right? It's very different to have a vulnerability, but be in control of yourself and know how to circumvent around it or how to not let it influence you, how to make sure it doesn't lead to bad decisions or, behaviors that we're going to regret. That is very different from saying, I have a vulnerability. I have to be careful. I have to be on the lookout for certain triggers and things like that. But I am managing it just well, right? And I know firsthand from working with so many people with different types of addiction, including food addiction and weight loss issues, that they are totally okay with accepting that this is a vulnerability they have, but it doesn't impact them anymore like it used to. And their life is on track, fulfilling in many, many ways. And like I've said before, it has almost always led to them being so much more successful in other areas of their lives as well. So today, I want to get real with you and disclose an experience that I had very recently that is related to this idea of humanness and being flawed. A disclosure, if you will. So, I have not had a binge episode in a very long time. I can't even remember. And now, remember, a binge episode is very different from an overeating episode, right? A binge episode it's triggered by urges, and the best way to explain it is you kind of feel like an automaton, like you're not really making the choice to eat, and it's almost always an excessive amount of food. Okay. And, that, of course, there's all different degrees and variations of what excessive is. But the resulting feeling always is guilt. That is very different from me saying, I'm going out on Friday night. I'm going to get a big porterhouse steak, 20-ounce plus, big heaping side of mashed potatoes, and it's planned, and I want to do it. And after I do it, I feel great. No guilt, because I was okay with doing that. It was a deliberate action. I always say this: the difference between an addictive compulsive behavior and one that is not is this idea of deliberateness. When you choose consciously and deliberately, there's a decision-making process that happens, and you say, I'm going to do this behavior versus I just did it and I'm not really sure why. So this experience happened to me last night. We all have our binge foods, right? Like that tends to be very person specific. Some people it's ice cream, some people it's cookies, other people it's cheese. For me, it's meat snacks like beef jerkies and nuts. So my wife is not really a big nut eater. She does like them, but it's not like something she regularly buys. Right? So this week she did buy this big container of peanuts. And last night, it was like an hour or so after dinner, just kind of hanging out. And a thought popped into my head. Oh, there's that big container of peanuts my wife bought. And without much thought, next thing I knew, I was dumping handfuls of nuts down my throat. Midstream, a thought occurred to me that this is unusual because it doesn't normally happen to me. I haven't done this in a really long time. And so I at first thought it had something to do with me really limiting my processed foods this week. And maybe it was like some kind of reaction, because that happens a lot of times. Like if you're addicted to something and you stop doing it, then you start obsessing about it more and you want it more. But then I quickly realized that that couldn't be the case because peanuts are not processed foods. So that would only make sense if I was shoving down my throat something that came in a box and was really processed, something, some kind of snack like that, like potato chips or something like that. But these were, you know, natural, I think they were even organic peanuts. Then the other thought occurred to me, well, nuts are a trigger food. And I said, wait a minute. We've had nuts in the house many times over the last several years. And it's, again, once in a blue moon kind of thing that I ever binge on them. So, one thing I've learned is to never beat myself up about it because I am human and flawed, and I do have this vulnerability. And so I certainly wasn't really upset with myself. Um, and while in the past, when I did this behavior a lot, I felt guilty for sure. I didn't feel guilty last night because it's not something that happens often. So I let myself off the hook very easily. However, I still wanted to understand why it happened to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or at least, it doesn't happen soon after this incident. I'm fine if it happens again several months from now, but it certainly won't be happy if it happens tonight or tomorrow night or next week. So I said, you know what? I have to practice what I preach here. What I always tell people, every addictive, compulsive kind of response is in relation to some psychological need, a perceived need, because it doesn't really fulfill the need, right? But in our mind, we think it does. So, what did I think this was going to do for me? What was going on with me? And it didn't take long to figure it out. There was something really bothering me last night about an hour before this binge episode. And the way I dealt with it was I gave it some attention and I used some cognitive strategies to combat any irrational thoughts that I had related to this thing that was bothering me, or thoughts that, kind of unfairly exaggerated the magnitude of it, made it worse than what it really was. I used all my cognitive strategies for that, but I didn't spend enough time on it because it was still bothering me. I could feel it. Even though I had kind of pushed it out of my mind, thinking that, okay, I used my cognitive strategies, I coped with it, I feel okay, I still wasn't feeling that okay about it. I kind of like deluded myself into thinking that I was over it. And sure enough, there was the connection. So here's the lesson to be learned, folks. One, yes, psychological dependencies can be overcome. They can be overcome by using real, genuine coping strategies instead of, if it's a food addiction, food to deal with whatever you're trying to deal with uh, it with food. So that's the biggest message, because when I figured it out last night, I took a lot more time to then process it, because what did that signify to me? You are not done coping with it. You did not successfully cope with this issue. And so now I feel like I have definitely processed and coped with this issue effectively. It is no longer bothering me, at least not to any significant degree. That's the biggest lesson. This stuff works. And what I espouse all the time, that you need to deal with the functions of these food addictions or food dependencies. This is just a great example of it. The second thing that you can learn from this is being able to manage triggers. And so nuts and things like that are not triggering for me anymore like they used to be, unless I'm not dealing with life like I should be, and I'm not effectively coping with issues like I should be as they arise. And then there's these triggers around the house, and then that's different, right? Triggers are very critical, though, in the early stages when you're trying to resolve this issue and get over this. So understand, the more that you can kind of manage these triggers, like if there's a certain food like ice cream, if you can tell your husband or your wife, hey, listen, just for this month, if you want to have that stuff, I don't want to like have punish you, but if you're going to have that kind of stuff, just don't tell me where it is. Just hide it somewhere. Put it somewhere that I don't know where it is. So that's like another kind of lesson that I think it's important for all of us to, really acknowledge, that triggers can be powerful, especially in combination with us using food for the wrong reasons. And then lastly, which I think is the most important lesson, acknowledge that you're a human being, acknowledge that you have flaws and vulnerabilities, and then that's okay. There's nothing to be ashamed about if you give in once in a while to this food dependency issue that we have. It's what you do with that. Like, does that turn into a pattern of binging for like the next several weeks or months? Or do you kind of like keep it isolated, learn from it, move on, and then, not have to have another one for a very long time? The strongest people are the ones that are aware of their vulnerabilities and know how to circumvent them or how to deal with them, how to address them, right? Strong people are not ones without flaws and vulnerabilities. Strong people are ones that know how to deal with them. So that's the biggest lesson here. If you have a slip, how do you handle that? And some of you may struggle with the idea that you're always going to have this vulnerability. I've had patients that struggled with this for a while, and it took a lot of work for them to eventually get to a place where they accepted this and it wasn't such a big deal. And it shouldn't be a big deal. And I'm not saying that in a flippant way, like, hey, you should just accept it. It's a process. But you should go through that process. And when you go through that process, you should get to the other side, which is a place of accepting that you have this flaw and vulnerability. And that doesn't make you any less of a person. It just makes you human. And the most important thing is acknowledging it and dealing with it. When you don't deal with it, when you don't acknowledge it, it runs rampant. It will totally control you and consume you. Don't think for a minute that if you deny it or not think about it, that it won't influence you. It influences you even more because now you're talking about it operating on an unconscious level, a level that you're not really aware of. And that's when really bad things can happen to us in terms of how we act and behave. This is Dr. Fields. I hope this was helpful. for those three reasons that I named before. And I hope that this video, more importantly, moves you forward and moves you on that path or journey towards finally losing the weight and keeping it off. I'll have more to say about this at another time. Hopefully, not about me slipping again. I wish all of you guys the best success with your weight loss. I'll talk to you soon.